For months, she brazenly parked her car blocking his driveway, as if it were her right, until James Jim Washington called a tow truck twice, and like lighting a match to a powder keg, everything exploded. The whole neighborhood witnessed the moment she crumpled in humiliation. Jim, 70, is a retired school counselor from Macon, Georgia. His entire life has been one of discipline, calm, and a love for the peace of his small single-story brick house with its neatly trimmed lawn. It's where he rests, remembers his late wife, and watches baseball in silence. But when that boundary was crossed time and time again, he knew patience has its limits. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. That house held deep meaning for Jim. He and Clara had bought it in the early days of their marriage, back when he was a young, passionate counselor, and Clara worked at the local library. Together, they painted every wall, planted every flower bush, and raised 2 kids in rooms now filled only with stillness. Clara passed away over a decade ago, leaving Jim with memories and an unfillable void, but the house still stood, a testament to their life together, and Jim saw keeping it up as a way to honor what they'd built. The narrow path from the street to the garage was part of that peace, not wide, not flashy, but his, where he parked after short trips into town, or welcomed rare guests like Darnell, who brought laughter and stories. He wasn't the type to stir trouble. He lived quietly, tended his garden, and always gave others the benefit of the doubt, until Margaret Maggie Pierce decided his driveway was hers. It started small. The first time Jim saw Maggie's gleaming white Audi Q5 parked in his driveway, he thought it was just a mistake. He'd just walked back from the nearby grocery store, hands full of bags, legs tired from a long day strolling the neighborhood. The shiny SUV sat smack in the middle of his driveway, its tires pressing into the grass he'd trimmed that morning. Jim paused, set his bags on the porch, and frowned at the car. Maggie was the new neighbor, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair, always in expensive clothes and sunglasses, even when it wasn't sunny. He'd heard Evelyn Harper, a shy widow, a few houses down, whisper that she was an HOA member, fond of bossing people around, and fining them over petty things. Jim walked over and knocked on Maggie's door. No rush, no anger. He wasn't the type to make a fuss over a car. Maggie opened the door, a glass of wine in one hand, her eyes flickering with faint surprise, as if she couldn't guess why he was there. "What's up, Jim?" she asked, her tone mock-startled, but edged with arrogance. Jim nodded toward his driveway. "Your car's in my spot," he said, voice even, no hint of anger. Maggie blinked, as if the thought had never crossed her mind. "Oh, I just ran in to grab something," she said, waving her wine glass carelessly. "It's no big deal, right?" Her voice was syrupy, but carried a condescending lilt, like she was doing him a favor by asking. Jim took a deep breath, exhaled through his nose, and kept his tone calm. "Not this time," he said, "but next time, park somewhere else, please." He didn't want a fight. It wasn't worth blowing up over. He turned back, picked up his bags, and went inside, figuring it was a one-off, a small mix-up from a new neighbor, not yet settled in. He'd lived long enough to know not everything was worth a battle, and he didn't want to disrupt his peace over something so minor. But he didn't expect that Maggie Pierce wasn't the type to stop at once. A few days later, when he stepped out to grab the morning paper, there was Maggie's gleaming white Audi Q5 parked smack in his driveway again, tires digging into the edge of his carefully trimmed grass. Jim stood there for a moment, rolled up paper in hand, eyes narrowing at the car. He told himself she probably had a reason, maybe company over, or she needed space to unload. No big deal, he thought. He'd give her one more chance. He didn't want to escalate things over a misplaced car, but it kept happening. Not just once but over and over. Some days Jim came home from the store, hands full of produce, only to find the white Audi blocking his driveway, forcing him to drag his tired legs and park down the street. Other days he'd be watering his garden when Maggie pulled in, parked right in the middle, like it was obvious, then stepped out with a tight smile and a half-hearted wave. Each time, she had an excuse that sounded reasonable, but never quite held up. "I just ran in to grab a jacket," she said once, holding a coffee cup, like she was in the middle of something urgent. Another time, she shrugged. "I got a delivery. The driver needed room to turn." Every explanation came with that pursed-lip smile and a wave, like it was no big deal. Jim didn't like it one bit. That driveway wasn't just a slab of concrete. It was part of the home he and Clara had sweated to build, part of the peace he cherished in his retirement years. But he wasn't the type to make a scene over small stuff. He'd lived long enough to know some people need time to learn respect, so he stayed calm. The second or third time, he knocked on Maggie's door again. She answered, wine glass in hand as usual, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes, like he was interrupting her. "Your car's in my spot again," Jim said, voice still even, no edge to it. Maggie blinked, like she was genuinely surprised. "Oh, I just popped in for a sec," she said, her tone sweet but dripping with arrogance. "It's no big deal, right?" She tilted her head, flashing that tight smile like it was enough to end it. Jim took a deep breath, irritation starting to simmer, but he kept his voice mild. "It bothers me," he said. "I need you to stop parking in my driveway." Maggie sighed dramatically, like he was overreacting to something trivial. "Fine, I'm right next door, Jim," she said, a hint of mockery in her tone. "It's not like I'm parking at a stranger's house." She waved a hand, brushing it off. Jim stood there, looking at her for a moment. He wanted to say something sharper, but he just nodded. "It's mine," he said simply, then went home. He didn't want an argument, not yet. He figured that warning would be enough for her to get it, but he was wrong. Over the next few weeks, that white Audi kept showing up in his driveway, like an uninvited guest. One day, he left a little note under the wiper, "Please don't park here," but the next day it was gone, and the car was still there. Some days he knocked, but Maggie wasn't home, or at least pretended not to be. Jim started to realize she wasn't just careless, she flat out didn't care. The neighbors started noticing too. Evelyn Harper, who sometimes brought Jim cookies, stood on her porch one day, peering over and muttering, "She's got some nerve, parking there like it's her house." Tommy Ruiz, the mechanic down the street, caught the Audi in Jim's driveway once and shook his head. "She thinks she owns the neighborhood, or something." But no one said much more, and Jim didn't want to drag them into it. He still held on to his patience, telling himself Maggie would get tired of it eventually. He didn't want to ruin his peace over an arrogant neighbor. It all came to a head one late afternoon. Jim had just walked back from the pharmacy in town, a bag of arthritis meds in hand that he took religiously. He was tired, hungry, and just wanted to sink into his old armchair with a hot cup of tea and forget the ache in his legs. But as he turned onto Peach Blossom Lane, there was Maggie's Audi parked dead center in his driveway, not an inch off, like she meant to claim it all. Jim stopped, the bag slipping from his hand to the porch, with a soft thud. He stood there, staring at the gleaming white car, and felt a hot surge rise in his chest. This time, no one was around, no sign of Maggie, or any excuse about to be offered. He took a deep breath, exhaled through his nose, trying to stay calm like always. Then he walked over and knocked on Maggie's door, the sound steady but firmer than before. She answered after a few minutes, wine glass in hand, her face a mix of annoyance and fake surprise. "What's up, Jim?" she asked, her tone syrupy but smug, like he was there just to bother her. Jim nodded toward the driveway. "Your car's in my spot again," he said, voice still even but harder this time. Maggie blinked, like it hadn't occurred to her. "Oh, I just got a delivery," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "The driver needed room to turn. It's no big deal, right?" That tight-lipped smile appeared, like it was enough to shut it down. Jim felt a pulse tick in his temple. "It bothers me," he said, voice still calm but clearer. "I need you to stop parking in my driveway." Maggie sighed dramatically, like he was blowing a tiny thing out of proportion. "I'm right next door, Jim," she said, her tone mocking. "It's not like I'm at a stranger's house." She smirked, shaking her head like he was the unreasonable one. Jim crossed his arms, looking her straight in the eye. "It's mine," he said, voice lower, "and I need it clear." Maggie let out a sharp laugh. "Fine, fine," she said, her tone like she was humoring a kid. "No need to make a big deal out of it. I'll move it." This time she did. She stepped out, started the car, and pulled the Audi over to her side. Jim stood there, watching her drive off, thinking maybe she finally got it. But he was wrong. In the days that followed, the car showed up again, sometimes dead center, sometimes off a bit, but still in his way. If he left a note, it vanished. If he knocked, she wasn't home, or pretended not to be. One evening, after a long day at the doctor for a checkup, Jim drove his old Buick home. He was exhausted, hands trembling slightly from the drive, just wanting to park and rest. But as he turned onto Peach Blossom Lane, he didn't just see Maggie's Audi in his driveway. He saw another car, a sleek black BMW, clearly not his, parked right beside it. Jim stopped on the street, staring at the scene, and felt his patience finally run dry. Enough was enough. He parked on the curb, got out, and snapped a photo with his phone for proof. Then he marched over and knocked on Maggie's door, harder this time, the sound ringing out like a statement. Maggie opened after a long pause, her face pure annoyance, no pretense. "Jim," she drawled his name, like he was a massive inconvenience. "Whose car is that?" Jim asked, pointing to the driveway. Maggie shrugged, her tone airy. "Oh, just a friend's," she said. "We're having a little get-together, and you weren't home, so I figured it was fine." Jim felt the blood rush to his head. "It's not fine," he said, voice shaking with restraint. "This isn't a parking lot, Maggie. This is my house." Maggie crossed her arms, tilting her head like he was the crazy one. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I'd have moved it." Jim clenched his jaw, taking a deep breath. "I'm saying it now," he replied. "Move it." Maggie glared at him, but finally went inside to get her friend. Jim stood there, waiting. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and by the 20th, he'd had enough. He went back home, sank into his armchair, and started looking up the number for a towing company in Macon. When he decided to call a tow truck to haul Maggie Pierce's Audi Q5 out of his driveway, he knew he'd crossed a line, not with the neighbor, but with himself. He didn't want trouble, but Maggie had pushed him there. The morning after that first tow, he woke early as usual, brewed a cup of coffee, and stepped onto the porch to admire the little flower garden he and Clara once tended. He hoped the shock would make Maggie see his driveway wasn't her free parking zone. But Maggie wasn't the type to back down easy. Just hours later, as Jim sat in his armchair reading, he heard a loud, sharp knock. He set the book down, stood slowly, stretching his stiff legs, and opened the door. Maggie stood there, blonde hair a mess, eyes blazing, phone in hand like she wanted to smash it in his face. "Where's my car?" she snapped. No preamble. Jim tilted his head, keeping his voice calm as ever. "Oh, you mean the one parked illegally in my driveway," he said, soft but with a bite of sarcasm. Maggie inhaled, nostrils flaring like she might explode. "Don't play games with me, Jim," she hissed. "Where's my car?" Jim shrugged, casual as if chatting about the weather. "It got towed," he said. "You can pick it up at Sunshine Towing on Mulberry." Maggie stared, mouth agape in stunned disbelief. "You did what?" she shrieked, her voice so shrill, Evelyn Harper, 2 houses down, probably heard it. Jim repeated, slow, like explaining to a child. "You wouldn't stop parking in my driveway, so I called a tow truck. Simple as that." Maggie let out a sharp, furious laugh. "You'll pay for this," she said, jabbing a finger at him. "Do you know who I am? I'm on the HOA. I have connections." Jim blinked slowly, unfazed. "Good for you," he said. "Have a nice evening." Then he shut the door, leaving Maggie alone with her rage. But Maggie didn't stop. She stood outside his house for another 10 minutes, yelling threats and curses, even calling the cops. When the officer arrived, he glanced at Jim's property deed and shrugged at Maggie. "It's his property," the cop said. "You want your car, pay the fee at the tow yard." Maggie stormed off, face beet red. But Jim knew it wasn't over, and he was right. Maggie wasn't the type to lose without a fight. She started retaliating, and this time she played dirtier. The next day, Jim got an email from the HOA, claiming his garden flowers violated community aesthetic standards. He chuckled reading it. Those flowers had been there over 20 years, since Clara's time, and no one ever complained. Then one evening, as he watered his garden, a neighborhood security car rolled up, lights flashing. A middle-aged guy stepped out, adjusting his belt like he was on important business. "You live here?" he asked. Jim frowned. "Yeah, why?" The guard cleared his throat. "We got a call about some suspicious activity." Jim sighed, glancing at Maggie's house. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, pretending she didn't know a thing. "Watering my garden is suspicious now," Jim said, voice dry. The guard looked awkward, but said nothing more, just got back in his car, and left. Maggie didn't stop there. She sent more complaints, once about his trash bins being out too long, another about faded paint on his mailbox. Jim read each one, smirked, and tossed them in the trash. He knew she was trying to drive him crazy, but he wasn't that easy to shake. He called the HOA, voice still calm. "I need you to do something about this," he told the woman on the line. She replied in a bored tone, "Sir, unless there's physical damage to your property, we don't step into neighbor disputes." Jim sighed. "I've talked to her a dozen times," he said. "We can send a reminder email." "That's it," she said. Jim hung up, knowing that email wouldn't change a thing, but Maggie wasn't done. One afternoon, Jim came home to find her Audi in his driveway again, this time parked at an angle like she didn't even care. He stood there, staring at it, anger flaring in his chest. He knocked on her door, harder than ever. She answered, wineglass in hand, looking relaxed after a long day. "Jim," she drawled his name, like he was the one bothering her. "I need you to move your car," he said, voice firm. She sipped her wine before answering. "Oh, I meant to tell you, but I figured you wouldn't mind, since you park on the street sometimes," she said, smirking. Jim clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "I do mind," he said. "This is my property." Maggie shook her head, like he was overreacting. "Jim, really, why get so worked up over a driveway?" Jim stepped closer, voice dropping. "I'm worked up because I've told you over and over, and you keep ignoring me." Maggie rolled her eyes, swirling her wineglass. "Fine, I'll move it," she said. But as Jim turned away, he heard her mutter something, too low to catch, but enough to hear the mocking tone. He turned back. "What'd you say?" Maggie shrugged, flashing an innocent smile. "Nothing." Jim looked at her, knowing she was baiting him. That weekend afternoon, Peach Blossom Lane buzzed more than usual. Jim's family, his grandson Darnell, his wife, and their 2 young kids, came over for a small backyard barbecue. Darnell had called ahead, promising to bring beef and buns, while Jim set up the charcoal and stocked some sodas in the fridge. He stood on the porch, gazing at the flower garden he and Clara once tended, feeling content at the thought of the kids' laughter filling the yard. But when he heard Darnell's car pull onto the street, he looked out and saw Maggie's gleaming white Audi Q5, parked dead center in his driveway, blocking the garage too. Darnell had to park on the curb, a good distance away, and Jim saw him step out, bags in hand, frowning at the white car in the way. Jim stood there, hands on hips, staring at the Audi like it was a direct challenge. He'd given Maggie enough chances, time after time. He'd talked, left notes, even called a tow once, but she wouldn't get it. He took a deep breath, anger rising in his chest, but he didn't let it erupt. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed Sunshine Towing on Mulberry. "Hi, this is Jim Washington," he said, voice calm, but steely. "I need a car towed, same spot as last time." The guy on the other end chuckled. "Let me guess, same car too?" "Yep," Jim said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We'll be there in 15, the guy said. Jim didn't knock on Maggie's door this time. He didn't leave a note, didn't call, he'd done all that already. He just stood on his porch, arms crossed, waiting. Darnell walked up, bags in hand, giving him a curious look. She parked there again. Huh, Grandpa? He asked. Jim nodded. Yeah, but not for long. Darnell smirked, shaking his head. She doesn't know who she's messing with. Minutes later, the tow truck rolled up, quiet but swift. The driver, a guy named Bobby Jim had met before, stepped out, gloved up, and eyed the Audi. Doing this again, huh? Bobby asked, amused. Looks like it, Jim said, pointing to the car. Bobby shook his head, grinning. Some people never learn. It didn't take long. Bobby hooked the car, lifted it, tires locked tight. Jim stood there, arms crossed, watching the white SUV leave his driveway with a deep sense of satisfaction. But just as the tow truck started rolling, Maggie burst out of her house, her scream cutting through the air like a siren. Stop! What are you doing? She yelled, running over in slippers, hair a mess. Jim sat down in a porch chair, sipping water from a bottle he'd grabbed, watching her like it was a show. Bobby didn't even glance at her, just kept securing the tires. Maggie spun to Jim, eyes blazing. You called a tow truck again? She shouted, pointing right at him. Jim raised an eyebrow, voice cool. You parked in my driveway again. Maggie balled her fists, face flushing red. I had guests. There's no room on the street. Jim tilted his head, unmoved. Not my problem, he said. Maggie let out a furious growl that echoed through the neighborhood. You're being petty, Jim, she snapped. I said I'd move it. Jim sighed, still relaxed. You've said that before, he said. And here we are. Maggie's face turned near purple. You don't know what you're doing, she hissed. I have connections. I can make things very hard for you. Jim laughed, a real laugh, ringing out in the quiet street. Oh, Maggie, he said, shaking his head. I think you're the one who doesn't get what's happening. He pointed at the tow truck. Your car's gone. Maggie spun around, and sure enough, the Audi was halfway down the street. She let out a piercing shriek, turning back to Jim with a look that could kill. You'll regret this, she snarled. Jim stood, brushing his hands on his pants like he'd just finished something light. No, Maggie, he said, voice low and steady. You're the one who'll regret it. He turned inside, just as Darnell and the family headed to the backyard, the kids' laughter drowning out Maggie's yells. She stood there alone on her porch, panting in helpless rage. But Jim knew she wasn't done. She wasn't the type to give up without one last flail, and he was ready. Just 2 days later, Maggie launched her campaign. An email went out to the whole neighborhood, from the HOA, titled, Regarding Recent Neighbor Disputes. It was worded cleverly, full of passive-aggressive jabs. We need to reconsider how we handle community conflicts to avoid unnecessary escalation. No names were dropped, but Jim knew it was about him. He sat in his armchair, reading it on his phone, and chuckled softly. Maggie clearly wanted to paint him as the villain, but she'd misjudged this neighborhood. Then the next morning, as he went to grab the paper, he saw flyers. Yes, flyers, neatly printed, laminated, and taped to every mailbox on Peach Blossom Lane. Is this the neighborhood we want? Towing neighbors' cars instead of talking to them. Jim yanked one off his mailbox, skimmed it, and shook his head. She was really going overboard over a driveway. But the funniest part? No one bought it. Maggie might have been on the HOA, but she wasn't well liked here. The morning after the flyers went up, Jim's phone lit up with texts from neighbors. Evelyn Harper wrote, "Saw the flyers, what's wrong with her? Everyone knows she's the troublemaker." Tommy Ruiz, the mechanic down the street, sent a short one. "She fined me $50 for leaving my truck out once. If she parks in your spot again, I'll chip in for the tow." Jim laughed out loud at that. He didn't even need to defend himself. People had seen Maggie's nonsense for ages. Petty fines, baseless complaints, that self-important attitude. Now that she'd humiliated herself in front of everyone, they were turning on her. The climax came at the next HOA meeting. Jim usually skipped these things. They were all about budgets, lawn care, and trivial stuff he didn't care for. But this time, he showed up, arms crossed, sitting front row, right across from Maggie. She wouldn't meet his eye, staring at the table like she was prepping for a big performance. The meeting started with the usual funds, watering schedules, trash bin reminders. Then Henry Tate, a neutral board member, cleared his throat. "We need to address a complaint about misuse of private property," he said, voice flat. Jim leaned back, waiting. Maggie sat up straighter, clearly ready to play victim. But then Henry went on. "This complaint is against Margaret Pierce." Maggie whipped her head around, eyes wide. "What?" she blurted, her voice cracking with shock. Henry glanced at the papers in front of him, unfazed. "We've received multiple reports of you harassing residents and misusing HOA resources for personal disputes," he said. A few other members shifted in their seats, looking uneasy, but no one spoke up for Maggie. Maggie turned to the board, face flushing. "You're siding with him?" she demanded, jabbing a finger at Jim. Henry shook his head. "We're siding with the community," he said. Maggie opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. She scanned the room for support, finding only cold stares or averted eyes. Evelyn Harper, sitting near Jim, whispered to him. She had it coming. Jim said nothing, just smirked. Maggie was losing control, and for the first time, she knew it. After that HOA meeting, Margaret Maggie Pierce's power on Peach Blossom Lane vanished like smoke in the wind. James Jim Washington sat on his porch the next morning, a hot coffee in hand, gazing at the little flower garden he and Clara once tended. He didn't need to do anything more. The community had stepped up, and Maggie finally faced the fallout of her own arrogance. The HOA had no choice but to boot her from the board, after a slew of complaints from Jim and other residents, reports of harassment, misuse of security, and petty retaliation. Maggie was no longer the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, and for the first time in months, Jim felt his driveway was truly his. Maggie didn't show her face to Jim after that. No words, no glares, no more complaint letters about his flowers or trash bins. She avoided him completely, like he was a ghost she couldn't face. One afternoon, as Jim watered his garden, he saw a for sale sign staked in her front yard. He paused, hose in hand, staring at the white sign, with bold red letters, and smiled faintly. Some said she left out of shame, others whispered she'd made too many enemies to stay. Jim didn't care why. When Maggie's moving truck rolled out of Peach Blossom Lane, he stood on his porch, took a deep breath, and let relief flood his chest. The neighborhood didn't just return to peace, it got better. People who'd stayed quiet under Maggie started speaking up. Evelyn Harper brought over a fresh batch of cookies, sitting with Jim on the porch, and chatting about how Maggie once griped at her over wind chimes. "She fined me $20 because they were too loud," Evelyn said, laughing and shaking her head. Tommy Ruiz, the mechanic down the street, offered to fix Jim's Buick for free as thanks for shutting that crazy lady down. Jim chuckled, declined politely, but felt the new bond among neighbors, something Maggie, with all her self-made authority, never brought. For the first time in months, Jim could pull his old Buick into his driveway without worrying about a white Audi in the way. No more ripped-up notes, no security knocks, no nonsense HOA letters. He stood in his yard, looking at the empty driveway, and felt a peace he'd lost since Maggie showed up. He planted a new flower in the garden, a bright red carnation, the kind Clara loved, as a quiet mark of this small victory. His single-story brick house, with its neat lawn and little driveway, was his sanctuary again. But Maggie's downfall didn't just end there. It became a little neighborhood legend. Neighbors started swapping stories of her past annoyances, like when she fined someone $50 for leaving a bike on their porch, or called security on a kid in a hoodie, playing outside. "I've lived here 10 years, never saw her help anyone," Tommy told Jim once as they chatted at the street's end. Sitting in the old armchair that once was Clara's, Jim reflected on what happened. He hadn't just defended his driveway, he'd helped the neighborhood shake off someone who'd bullied them with petty power for years. Maggie might have thought she was untouchable, with her connections and HOA seat, but she was wrong. He remembered her smirks, her threats, the way she tried to make him the bad guy to everyone. But in the end, her arrogance brought her down. Jim didn't do much. He just stood firm, kept at it, and let the community do the rest. The lesson was clear, he thought. Some people think they can push others forever, that they can be selfish, manipulative, and rotten, without anyone pushing back. They think they'll get away with it because no one's ever made them pay. But then they run into someone who won't bend, like Jim, and when that person stands up, the world watches them fall. Maggie didn't just lose his driveway, she lost her power, her reputation, and finally her place on Peach Blossom Lane. He didn't need to yell or stoop to petty games. He just stayed patient, stayed right, and let the truth speak. Jim stepped into the garden, a new red carnation in hand to honor Clara. He planted it, smoothed the soft soil over its roots, and smiled. His driveway was clear, the neighborhood was calm, and birds sang again like before Maggie came. He sat on the porch, watching sunlight filter through the peach trees, and felt his life settle back into the rhythm he loved. The fight was over, and he'd won, not because he was stronger, but because he never gave up what was his. The story of James Jim Washington and Margaret Maggie Pierce mirrors a familiar reality in American life today: the tension between individual rights, community, and petty neighborhood squabbles. In the U.S., where private property is king, Maggie's constant trespass on Jim's driveway, a space he cherished as a symbol of his life and memories, with Clara, is a classic snapshot of neighbor disputes, from parking spats to overzealous HOA rules. Maggie, with her HOA role and haughty attitude, embodies the type who abuses small power to impose their will, a not uncommon sight in American suburban communities, where HOAs can turn into control freaks instead of helpers. Jim, on the other hand, an older, patient black man, shows resilience and dignity, traits often seen in those who've faced plenty of challenges in America's diverse but sometimes unfair society. The takeaway from this story applies straight to real life in the U.S. today. Stand up for your rights calmly and legally, like Jim did by calling the tow truck twice instead of letting emotions take over. When Maggie hit back with emails, flyers, and security, Jim didn't snap. He kept evidence and leaned on the community. A smart move in America, where the law and social support can be big weapons. Modern American life demands a balance between self and society, and Jim's story proves that patience, righteousness, and unity, like Evelyn and Tommy backing him, can beat selfishness and overreach. Learn from Jim, hold your ground, use the system like property laws, and trust the community will side with what's right when the truth comes out. If you enjoyed the story of Jim defending his driveway against arrogant Maggie, hit subscribe so you don't miss more great tales. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video with more valuable life lessons.